There are days when you look at your to-do list or even at something small and simple and feel an immediate resistance in your body. Not dramatic refusal, not rebellion, just heaviness. You know what you need to do. You know it's important. You may even care about it deeply, and yet you can't start, or you start and stop, or you scroll instead. And eventually the conclusion forms almost automatically. I'm lazy. I lack discipline. Something is wrong with my work ethic. But what if that conclusion is completely inaccurate? What if the issue isn't a lack of motivation, but a system that is running beyond capacity? Laziness implies unwillingness. It suggests indifference, apathy, or desire to avoid effort entirely. But if you look closely at your experience, that's usually not what's happening. Most people who call themselves lazy care too much, not too little. They think about their responsibilities constantly. They feel guilt about unfinished tasks. They replay what they should have done. That isn't apathy. That's cognitive load. That's a brain that hasn't had space to shut down. Your brain has a limited amount of processing capacity at any given time. Attention, emotional regulation, decision-making, impulse control, planning, all of these functions draw from the same pool of mental energy. When that pool is depleted, behavior changes. Starting tasks feels harder. Switching tasks feels harder. Even simple actions feel heavier than they should. From the outside, this looks like laziness. From the inside, it feels like friction. Neuroscience offers a clearer explanation. The part of your brain responsible for planning and initiating action, the prefrontal cortex, is extremely sensitive to stress and overload. When you are juggling too many demands, unresolved emotions, constant notifications, social evaluation, and future uncertainty, the prefrontal cortex becomes less efficient. It doesn't shut off completely, but it loses flexibility. Tasks that once felt manageable now feel abstract and overwhelming. The brain shifts from execution mode into preservation mode. Preservation mode prioritizes immediate relief over long-term goals. That's why scrolling feels easier than writing. Why watching something feels easier than deciding something. Why cleaning feels easier than confronting a complicated project. Your nervous system is not trying to sabotage you. It's trying to conserve energy. When the system detects overload, it pulls you toward behaviors that require less cognitive effort. The problem is that modern life keeps the system in near constant activation. Information overload plays a major role here. Your brain was not designed to process this volume of input: messages, updates, comparisons, responsibilities, opinions, content. Even when you're not consciously thinking about them, they occupy background processing space. Open tabs in your mind, unfinished conversations, decisions waiting to be made. Each one uses a small amount of energy. Alone, they are manageable. Together, they create saturation. Emotional load compounds this further. Unresolved tension in relationships, worry about the future, internal self-criticism. These are not separate from productivity. They directly affect it. Emotional regulation consumes cognitive resources. If part of your brain is constantly managing anxiety, suppressing frustration, or navigating self-doubt, that energy is not available for task initiation. So when you sit down to work and feel resistance, you are not starting from zero. You are starting from -20. Another factor is decision fatigue. Every choice you make throughout the day, even small ones, draws from your mental reserves. What to eat, what to reply, what to prioritize, whether to rest or push through. The more unstructured your environment, the more decisions you have to make. Over time, the cost accumulates. By the time you face something meaningful, your system may already be drained. The inability to act then feels like a character flaw, but it's often a capacity issue. There is also a psychological layer to overload that often goes unnoticed. When you have too many expectations placed on you, externally or internally, the brain struggles to prioritize. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels important. And when everything feels important, nothing feels clear. Clarity is what drives action. When clarity disappears, hesitation increases. That hesitation is often mislabeled as laziness, when in reality, it's decision paralysis. Modern productivity culture intensifies this misinterpretation. We're constantly exposed to examples of extreme output, hyper-discipline, early mornings, optimized routines. When you compare your internal experience of friction to someone else's curated display of momentum, the gap feels personal. But what you're comparing is invisible load versus visible output. You don't see their exhaustion, their support systems, their context. You only see performance, and performance without context creates shame. Shame further increases overload. When you call yourself lazy, your brain registers threat. Self-criticism activates the same stress pathways as external criticism. Cortisol rises, the nervous system tightens. Under stress, the prefrontal cortex becomes even less efficient. So the very judgment you use to motivate yourself reduces your ability to act. The cycle feeds itself. You feel stuck, you criticize yourself, you become more overloaded, you feel more stuck. It's important to recognize that overload doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels like numbness, like staring at a task without emotional engagement, like caring intellectually but not physically. That numbness is not emptiness. It's the nervous system's attempt to dampen stimulation. When the system is flooded for too long, it shifts toward shutdown. From the outside, shutdown looks like laziness. From the inside, it's protection. The key distinction here is this: laziness is a character judgment. Overload is a systems problem. One attacks identity, the other explains capacity. And the difference matters because identity-based explanations don't lead to sustainable change. If you believe you are inherently lazy, every moment of friction confirms the belief. If you understand that you are overloaded, friction becomes information. It tells you something about the state of your system, not your worth. When you begin to look at your behavior through the lens of load instead of morality, patterns emerge. You notice that resistance increases after social exposure, after too many decisions, after emotional conflict, after poor sleep. You start to see that productivity isn't a fixed trait. It fluctuates with cognitive and emotional bandwidth. And that fluctuation is not failure, it's physiology. Most people don't need more discipline. They need fewer simultaneous demands. They don't need harsher self-talk. They need nervous system regulation. But as long as overload is misinterpreted as laziness, the response will always be force. And force, applied to an already saturated system, rarely produces clarity. It produces collapse. The real shift begins not with pushing harder, but with asking a different question. Instead of, why am I so lazy? The question becomes, what is my brain currently carrying? That question doesn't shame, it investigates. An investigation is what begins to change the pattern. To really understand why this matters, you have to look at what happens when overload goes unrecognized for too long. When you repeatedly label yourself as lazy instead of overloaded, you start applying the wrong solution. You try to force motivation. You increase pressure. You remove rest. You compare yourself to people who appear more disciplined. And for a short period, that pressure might work. Adrenaline can override exhaustion temporarily, but adrenaline is not sustainable fuel. It is an emergency resource. When you rely on it too often, the system eventually crashes. This is why many people cycle between short bursts of intense productivity and long stretches of paralysis. They push through until they can't. Then they collapse into avoidance. Then they feel guilty. Then they push again. It feels like a character flaw, like inconsistency or weakness. In reality, it's a nervous system oscillating between overdrive and shutdown. Both states are responses to overload. Another reason rest doesn't always fix the problem is because not all exhaustion is physical. You can sleep 8 hours and still wake up mentally saturated. That's because cognitive load doesn't disappear overnight. If you go to bed with unresolved stress, unfinished tasks, emotional tension, and constant input from the day, your brain continues processing in the background. Sleep restores energy, but it doesn't automatically resolve accumulated mental clutter. There's also a difference between passive rest and restorative recovery. Scrolling, binge watching, and distraction can feel like rest because they don't require effort, but they often add more input instead of clearing space. True recovery reduces stimulation. It gives the prefrontal cortex room to recalibrate. Without that recalibration, the system stays crowded, and a crowded system resists new demands. This is why sometimes you sit down to work and feel a strange internal resistance that you can't logically explain. It's not that you don't want to succeed, it's that your brain doesn't perceive enough available capacity to begin. Starting a task requires cognitive bandwidth. It requires working memory, planning, emotional regulation, and sustained attention. If those resources are already allocated elsewhere, even subconsciously, initiation feels impossible. There's an additional psychological factor that deepens overload: unresolved self-expectation. When your standards exceed your capacity, the brain experiences constant internal conflict. You believe you should be doing more, achieving more, handling more. That belief runs quietly in the background, creating tension even when you're not actively working. The gap between expectation and energy becomes another layer of load, and that gap is rarely acknowledged as the true source of exhaustion. It's important to understand that overload doesn't always come from doing too much. It often comes from thinking about too much. Open loops consume energy. Tasks you haven't started, conversations you haven't finished, decisions you haven't made, each one occupies mental space. The brain dislikes unfinished patterns. It keeps them accessible in working memory, ready to be addressed. When too many loops remain open, the system feels chronically behind even if you're technically free. So how do you distinguish laziness from overload? Laziness is indifference toward outcome. Overload is desire without capacity. If you care about the result but feel blocked from starting, that's not laziness. If you think about the task repeatedly but avoid it anyway, that's not laziness. If you feel relief when something gets canceled, not because you didn't want it but because you were stretched thin, that's not laziness. Those are signs of saturation. The shift begins with reducing load before demanding output. Instead of asking your brain to produce more, you ask it to carry less. That can mean simplifying commitments, closing small open loops, writing tasks down instead of storing them mentally, creating clearer priorities so everything doesn't compete equally for attention. When clarity increases, initiation becomes easier. Not because you became more disciplined, but because the system regained space. It also means regulating the nervous system directly, slowing down your breathing, reducing stimulation, taking breaks that actually disconnect instead of switching platforms, movement that grounds rather than distracts. These actions don't look productive, but they restore executive function. They shift the brain out of threat mode and back into planning mode. And planning mode is where action lives. Another powerful change comes from adjusting self-talk. When you replace "I'm lazy" with "my system is overloaded," the emotional tone shifts, shame decreases, curiosity increases, and curiosity is far more effective than criticism. When the brain doesn't feel attacked, it doesn't need to defend itself. It can allocate energy towards solving the problem instead of protecting identity. There's also value in narrowing focus deliberately. Overload thrives on abstraction. When tasks are vague, they feel larger than they are. The brain interprets ambiguity as complexity. Breaking work into extremely specific next steps reduces perceived threat. Not write the report, but open the document and outline 3 points. Specificity reduces cognitive friction. Friction is what your mind has been calling laziness. Over time, as you reduce load instead of increasing pressure, something changes. Starting becomes less dramatic. There is less internal debate, less negotiation. The gap between intention and action shrinks. You don't feel superhuman. You feel clear. And clarity is often what people mistake for motivation. The final and most important point is this: laziness is a moral label. Overload is a neurological condition. One attacks who you are. The other describes what your brain is experiencing. When you shift from identity judgment to systems understanding, your behavior changes naturally. You stop fighting yourself. You start working with your capacity. You were never incapable. You were saturated. You weren't avoiding effort. You were conserving energy in a system that felt constantly demanded. And once you understand that, the question stops being, how do I become less lazy? And becomes, how do I build a life my nervous system can actually sustain? When your brain is no longer carrying everything at once, action doesn't require force. It becomes the natural next step. And the relief you feel in that moment isn't pride and discipline. It's the quiet realization that nothing was wrong with you in the first place.